Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You're with Ian.
And with Mike.
In the same room as each other, as we explore the Aubrey Maturin novels of one of our favourite authors, Patrick O'Brien. Mike, here we are. Would you ever please catch us up from last time?
Oh, I would be so delighted, Ian.
Oh, very fantastic.
Well, last time, just when Stephen had given up hope of getting Sophie to ask Jack to sail her to the Downs, Sophie, Cecilia, and Admiral Haddock come aboard to arrange that very trip. Jack, getting ready for the girls to be on board, turns the cabin into a cross between a brothel and an undertaker's parlor. Jack and Sophie on that cruise came to an understanding never to marry anyone else. Stephen was not there. He was on an intelligence mission where he learned that Spain will join France against England if a huge shipment of gold arrives in Cadiz. Stephen, working with the Admiralty, arranged for the Lively under Jack's command to be part of the English squadron sent to intercept the gold. As he's waiting to get his written orders, Stephen was shocked to see Diana without her natural grace at the opera with Canning and some minor royals. And sitting there looking across, he realized that he would never be attracted to this Diana. He wondered if he'd made up the other Diana or if he'd had a hand in her death. Wow. Well, this time, the Lively goes into action. Jack receives surprising insights into Stephen's secret life and Admiralty connections. Weather disrupts the English squadron. After a tense negotiation and Jack refusing to defy luck or touch a belaying pin, things blow up as Post Captain comes to an end, or maybe a beginning.
Exciting times, Mike. Just before we get into it, tell us what's been going on in your life. How did we both get here?
Well, it's funny. As many of you know, I just moved from Florida back to North Carolina, and I was flying from North Carolina back to Florida. And on my first little connection out of Asheville, I want to stop and say hi to my airline acquaintance who I met in the terminal as I was sitting writing this episode, and then who happened to be across the aisle from me as I was sitting on the plane writing this episode. Tracy from Sussex. Sussex in the Downs, so I'm writing about the Downs. She's now residing in Hendersonville, North Carolina. And so wanted to thank you, Tracy, for the tale of your romantic move to the States 35 years ago. Well done. So delighted to now have a neighbor who knows about the Lover's Hole. Hope your next flight was a good one. Mine certainly was.
Oh, wonderful. And thank you to all of you for the questions that you've been sending us on social media for the Bicentenary Q&A episode. That opportunity is now done. We're literally about to record it as we speak. So thank you very much for your questions. And as you can hear, we're really happy that we're together in the same room for this episode. We're hoping that you'll get to hear the difference. And maybe in a more positive way than we had last time we did this together, Mike.
Sound was terrible.
The audio was terrible. Anyway, here we are, Mike. Get us started. Second half, final chapter of Post Captain. Stephen was in the depths of despair, having kind of said his farewells to his love for Diana last time. Where are we going to pick this story up?
Well, it's long before dawn, and the bosun's mates are running through the Lively, roaring, all hands on board ship, rise and shine, show a leg there. And O'Brien tells us the 100 or so women aboard make their way ashore as the ship unmoors and stands for the North Foreland. The crew buzzes with questions. Had Boney started as an invasion? Why were they ordered to sea with only half their water? Who was the civilian and the officer that boarded from the Port Admiral's barge last night?
It's great, Mike. There's a little ambiguity about the statement, and we're being introduced to some of the mystery of who came aboard just bit by bit. There's a hint that the crew think that two people, an officer and a civilian, came aboard, and that's because they noticed attributes that can't be combined in one person. The attributes of being a civilian and the attributes of having an officer's commission. And the mystery of how they heard those two things together is going to unfold in the next paragraph or two, maybe a couple of pages, and we'll see what everybody has actually seen and witnessed while we try and figure out who it was that came aboard. Now, Mike, in the gun room, besides debating who the new arrival is, there was some uneasiness. The word was among the officers that Dr. Maturin was back on board, and they dreaded what he might have brought with him. And Mike, this is like, oh no, not the bees again.
Right.
Lieutenant Dashwood couldn't say for sure that it was the doctor, but here's the sign. Here's the sign. He says, who else comes up the side like a left-handed bear? I'm like, I think that's the sign that this was a civilian, right? They're thinking it was Stephen. Now, if you're counting bear references in Post Captain, there's another one to the total. Probably the last one. Meanwhile, though, they could tell that an officer had come aboard because they heard from Bondon, who had hailed the boat, that they would have had an aye back from the boat saying there's an officer on board. So, in their world, the doctor is not an officer. The doctor is a warrant officer. They don't know the special deal that's been put in place for Stephen Maturin. Anyhow, they haven't got their minds across that yet. They turn back to general topics. The purser is worried. He says he doesn't have enough stores for the long journey, and he's very sure that they are headed to Fernando Poo for reasons, as he says, of high strategy. So, Mike, Fernando Poo, besides having a curiously romantic name, that must mean something. Tell us where that's from.
Yeah, I was just certain this has got to be, one of those deep references. And I thought, okay, let's find out. Fernando Poo. Okay, it's an island off Equatorial Guinea in the Bight of Biafra, now called, I believe, Bioko. Okay. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly or not. I apologize. And that name was changed. So it's no longer named after this, 15th century Portuguese navigator, Fernando or Poe. I couldn't find, though, any Royal Navy connection, not until 1827 to 1843, when the British leased bases at what they called Port Clarence. Yes, that Clarence, the Duke of Clarence, that we've talked about many times, but doesn't figure into this story. It was much later in time the site of Operation Postmaster, a January 1942 British specialist operation that boosted the SOEs, the Special Operations Executives, the folks that were kind of really involved in espionage and sabotage and reconnaissance. It boosted their reputation because they successfully boarded and took an Italian and German merchant ship out of their harbor after luring the ship's officers to a party on shore. So it's great skullduggery. And they did it while all the other British officials in the area refused to support the operation because they did not want to breach Spanish neutrality. Oh, here we have, we're about to breach Spanish neutrality. Maybe a connection there. However, I couldn't help but notice that in the text, Fernando Poo is spelled P-O-O. Everywhere else, including the navigator's name, is spelled P-O. Now, is this P-O-O, in parentheses P, another potty humor joke from O'Brien? I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past him.
It's great. So the gun room think they're onto the track of what's going on here. It turns out they're on the wrong track. Mm-hmm. Jack is actually having to catch up himself with sealed orders. He comes back to the cabin of the Lively in his nightshirt, takes a look at these immediate orders and a separate sealed package that he has to open when they get to latitude 43 degrees, which is a fair way south of the southern harbours of the UK. And he apologises to Stephen, he says, for luring him aboard under false pretenses, and goes on to say, I'm terribly sorry, the trip to the West Indies is off. We have a rendezvous off the Dodman, all these sealed orders that I have to open later. Jack asks Stephen what that could mean. As Stephen, notice his reply, he says, I have no idea. And we'll come back to the meaning and truthfulness of that in a second. Meanwhile, Jack has no idea what's going on. He damns the Admiralty for all this utmost dispatch stuff and for mucking up their plans. And as Jack carries on reading his paperwork here, he looks up, saying, oh, Stephen, I thought you said you had no idea, but these orders here say that in case of separation of the ships or other eventualities, he, Jack Aubrey, is requested and directed to avail himself of the counsels and advice of S. Maturin, Esquire, etc., etc., appointed pro hac vice a captain in the Royal Navy, blah, 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 knowledge and discretion, blah, blah, blah. Now, Mike, this is the moment where
Right.
a couple of things start to become clear. First of all, we get a clue about who the officer was that merited an II from the boat, but Stephen said he had no idea, right?
Right. And so, clearly Stephen's been caught out in a lie here. But Stephen merely says, it's possible that Jack may be required to undertake some negotiations and that he, Stephen, may be of some use in them. And Jack says, well, he'll have to be discreet himself, it appears. And he looks wonderingly at Stephen. He says, but you did say... And Stephen's like, well, now listen, Jack. Well, yeah, right. I'm somewhat given to lying. My occasions require it from time to time, but I do not choose to have any man alive tell me of it. And I couldn't help but think, any man who wants to remain alive, don't call me out on this. And so I'm thinking, this happened once before in this book, right? But Jack plows right on, saying, I'd never dream of such a thing. And then he remembers,
I did actually dream of such a thing.
Yeah, I actually said this to your face when you were hiding another intelligence mission, which I didn't know about. I called you a liar. And that's how we almost got into a duel with one another. So he adds, I wouldn't dream of such a thing, not when I am in my right mind. And then Jack adds, about this thing of discretion here and everything. Jack says, quite apart from my love for you, it is far, far too dangerous. Hush, mum's the word. Tasse is the Latin for a candle. And Jack understands. It says he's amazed that he didn't smoke it before. And he tells Stephen what a deep old file he is, and that Jack now twigs it. And Stephen replies, do you, my dear? Bless you. And I really love this because I'm thinking, Stephen's thinking, Jack didn't know anything before. He, all that stuff that came with that. Now Jack's saying, now you're a deep old file, but I get it all. And I'm thinking, Stephen's saying here, I'm not sure that you really do, Jack, my friend. Or maybe I don't exactly twig it myself, as we'll see in a minute here.
Yeah.
Right. Whenever there's Latin, we turn to Karen, and I miss catching her this week. But can you help us on this Latin phrase? Stephen's pro hac, is it?
Pro hac vice or pro hac vice?
I wondered the same, right?
I think naval people reading it,
right.
British speakers reading it in an order would read pro hac vice. I think in Latin it means for this occasion or on this occasion only.
Right.
Meaning that it's a temporary sort of acting in, acting up appointment. As we're going to hear, it's not the commonest thing in the world, but it gives Stephen the status of a captain, not necessarily equal in seniority to Jack, but having the same stature. And we have to do a bit of puzzling, as does Jack, about exactly why it could be that Stephen's been given this sort of symbolic rank. Now, that's the naval side. This idea of tace being the Latin for a candle, that's a whole little phrase all by itself there.
Yeah, and I love this, Ian. For those of us who have followed us through the canon, we've heard this. We're hearing it in Post Captain here. We heard it in Fortune of War, Clarissa Oakes. We heard it in the Commodore.
Wow.
Actually, candela is the Latin for candle.
Of course.
TACE is the Latin singular imperative tense of the usual verb for be silent. So, no, not candle at all, but a candle is a symbol of the light. So the phrase, as Jack's using it here, means keep quiet, keep it dark. Don't throw light upon it. Yeah. And this, my Latin pronunciation is from no one. No one gets to blame that but me. But the interpretations are for Anthony Gary Brown in his Guide for the Perplexed, as well as the Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, an 1898 publication from Philadelphia, who I thought might be a little closer to our source here.
Absolutely. And who hasn't got the 1898 Philadelphia Dictionary of Phrase and Fable on their bookshelves?
Right.
Well, this is still a bit of a puzzle. Jack himself is really flabbergasted by the way they've given Stephen this temporary commission, since the Navy is so jealous of rank. And the whole of the last 2 books really have been predicated on the idea that you don't get a commission, and you certainly don't get a post-captain's equivalent rank in the Navy just for asking it or just for fun. Jack says he's only heard of it once before, and he says, well, this must mean they think the world of you in Whitehall. And Stephen wonders to himself, well, he doesn't really know, but why do I need to have this great grand commission? Why can't I be just your guest? And Jack starts to have an idea about what this might mean. Jack then asks if he could, without any great indiscretion, ask whether this could turn out to be a profitable expedition. And Stephen says, well, it might be. And Jack says, okay, I've smoked it. They're going to cut you in on prize money, have you share as a captain on this mission, wherein specifically there are no other admirals sticking around to take a share. These are Admiralty orders, so everyone gets a bigger share, and anyone with the substantive rank of captain stands to get a pretty handsome cut. And this seems to make Stephen quite happy.
Yeah, Stephen says, what a pretty thought from Sir Joseph. Remarkably delicate. We know back from last chapter that Stephen's never taken any money despite all the offers. He does this, for his beliefs. But Sir Joseph's saying, you don't have to ask for any money, but we're gonna take care of you here. And now it gets Stephen thinking, and he says, well, I don't regret sending Sir Joseph my gynandromorph. It was a princely gift.
Right.
And so Stephen turns to Jack and he says, well, what, say, hypothetically would be a captain's share of £1 million?
Asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend. Jack, goes through the math, says £75,000. And Jack says, and so much more the pity, because there's no longer any prizes like that.
Yeah.
But Stephen's not listening to that part. He's saying to himself very seriously, what did Sir Joseph think I would do with, what did he think any reasonable man would do with that much money? And I think Jack sees that Stephen is dead earnest right now, and that piques his interest.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, this is characterization between Jack and Stephen. Stephen, the otherworldly, as we've known him and we're going to know him. But Jack says, I know precisely what I would do, because he knows just what this could mean for his fortunes. And he just, I love this little bit here. We don't get a big outburst or an emotional, triumph. He thinks, oh, crap, now I've got to go and make sure we're sailing as fast and as efficient. So he steps out of the cabin, yells at the crew, checks all the sails, issues orders to be sure that they all continue to stay, tautly gathered in, watches to make sure that everyone obeys him and returns. And O'Brien says, leaving some tart comment behind and leaving the crew members wondering what their captain was up to now, giving himself airs. They are excellent sailors aboard the Lively, and now all of a sudden, this fairly streetwise Captain Aubrey is suddenly micromanaging the tension of the before topgallant topsail. He must be headed, they think, to see his beautiful mistress, Sophia. I love this moment. I can't remember quite how much I got of this on my first reading, but now it's really, really clear. We talked when Jack and Stephen came away from the action with the Polycrest about how sort of under the covers the resolution of their quarrel is. It's really clear now, if you've been willing to wait for it for about 5 chapters, that they are absolutely fine again. And it's a really wonderful moment. Jack and Stephen have got the chance for this immense payoff, and the payoff is partly financial and partly that their quarrel is resolved. Yeah. And it's resolved to the extent that they can talk about it, and Stephen can give a name to the fact that he has to lie and that they don't have to, point threats at each other, and they get to benefit from the fact that they now have these 2 roles next to each other. It's a really, really lovely moment for them, I think.
Yeah, and while Jack never apologized directly to Stephen, he did apologize, we said, to the universe, but now he's saying, basically, Stephen, I wasn't in my right mind.
Yeah.
So I think that's as good as absolutely. Well done. Yeah. Well done, Ian. Well, Stephen, when Jack returns, is sitting there in the cabin speculating about all the natural philosophy journeys he could undertake with all that money.
Right.
But then he kind of recollects himself and says, but wait, Jack, I haven't asked you about Sophie's experience on the ship on this last journey. And Jack, goes into a long explanation, talks about the beautiful sailing they'd done, how they'd left the Amethyst standing behind Redface, as the speed of the Lively had taken off, how in the dead calms they'd reached their agreement, Sophie and Jack together. And as he's talking, he sees that Stephen is falling asleep. So he points us out, Stephen, are you asleep? And he's like, no, as we'll see many times. The canon, right? Nobody will ever admit to being asleep. He does say, though, I am weary. And it says, where should I sleep? And Jack goes, oh my gosh, that's a really good question. Well, wait, did they tell you what your seniority is?
Right.
and Stephen's like, what are you talking about, seniority? He said, well, in your letter, he said, I just read the little part where they thought a lot about me, and that was really nice. I have no idea. And Jack says, well, let's assume perhaps because of the light, maybe I'm your senior. So I'm going to sleep on this side of the cabin. They have two cots next to each other, but you'll sleep on the other side. But every time we go about, because it's not the right or the left, we're going to actually have to switch every time the ship goes about. And I think he sees the look on Stephen's face, and he goes like, "It's my little joke," and he laughs at his own wit, and then says, "Stephen, tell you what, there's my cot. It's the best cot in the cot. You take that one." So again, I think underlining, as you say, Ian, we're all back and good.
Now, Jack points out a piece of formality that Stephen won't have thought about. He says, well, this is an unusual situation, and with two people of the rank of captain, in theory, they both need to be read into the ship's company, and so we'll have to find a way to get you read into the ship's company. And Stephen says, well, if it's at all possible, I'd like us to find a way not to do that. And of course, that's because he knows that it's better for him to remain unobserved, for this part of his character to be concealed from the world as much as possible. He's now relying on Jack's discretion. And with another hark back to the real mortal danger of him disclosing his character to his friends and the real mortal danger to him in the world of espionage, he says, there are moments when my life may turn upon it. And that really serious statement, I think, Mike, probably is the moment where you can really say that Jack has twigged what's going on.
Yeah, you might not have twigged it before, but you sure do now, brother.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, Jack could indeed be trusted, but you might not say the same for the captains of the other ships, who start to gather in this little squadron here. The Medusa comes tearing out of Plymouth, carrying aboard a dark gentleman known to speak Spanish, who stays closeted with the captains of the Medusa, the Lively, and the Amphion, all lying off the Dodman, waiting for the last ship. And the crew, and the crew's plural, I guess you could say, continue to believe that this is some important urgent mission. They have figured out that maybe Spain has come in or is about to come in, and so the Spanish merchant ships that used to cruise by with immunity might now stand to become prizes. So they've already got some idea that there's some wealth to be made here. They speculate already, without knowing about the treasure, that there could be enough wealth for a foremast Jack to make 5 years' pay in an afternoon. So,
wow.
Jack's not the only one with his eye on the main chance here.
Right. Well, finally, the Indefatigable arrives, signaling form in line astern. So we've now found the senior captain here, so the Commodore, and they signal, make all suitable sail. And the Livelies are spending a lot of time, this group that's usually kind of quiet and very methodical and everything, they're very busy because they're trying not to run over the Amphion or overrun. I got to keep a distance back here. Would you guys speed up? It's driving me crazy here. Well, when they finally get, as you said, Ian, far enough south, Jack opens the sealed orders after this last captain's council aboard the Indefatigable, and it becomes quite certain now that they're to intercept a Spanish squadron sailing to Cadiz from the River Plate. And everyone grows impatient. Now it's like, okay. And of course, this news is, as always, is going to spread through the ship. So everybody's like, let's go, 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 go. And on Sunday evening, they're looking around and the weather's very dirty indeed. It looks a little ominous, and they all welcome it. And I was kind of in my own mind thinking, wait. We're going chasing and there's this huge storm coming in. Is that good news?
Right. Last time we had urgent action, it was actually turned out to be a good thing that the weather was quite mild back when the Polycrest went across the channel. Anyway, it's a sea adventure book, so it's high time we had some weather. The storm does indeed come in, and there are men on the Lively who've been at sea for years who, despite that, become sick. And I like this little moment of Jack coming in to take care of Stephen. He comes in, 2 bells in the middle of watch, in the middle of the night. He's been on deck for a long time. He tells Stephen in his usual very understated way that it's coming on to blow, which is his way of saying, this is nothing, but it's starting to get a bit windy here. Stephen's got no patience for this and calls him out for exaggerating. Now, Jack Aubrey loves a good blow. He's delighted that this is going to hold the Spanish back. So actually, this blow is good for the timing of the rendezvous to lie in wait for the treasure ships. He certainly doesn't want those treasure ships to get anywhere near Cadiz before their squadron's in place. And Stephen's going, yeah, that's all fine. But can you fasten a string that I've got attached to my cot so that I can pull it to moderate the motions? The motions that he says exaggerate his symptoms. He's not willing to say that the motions causing his symptoms, but they are exaggerating his symptoms. Now, Jack's going to really poke at this with his conversational stick here. Oh, are you queasy, sick? Not at all, says Stephen. How foolish. I was bitten by a tame female horseshoe bat, and I doubt her sanity. His symptoms he describes as being similar to Ludolphus's description of the disease from the horseshoe bat. So Jack is going, oh, you see, sick? And Stephen's going, no.
Right.
I've got weird bat fever. Go away.
What? It's almost now like Jack becomes the medico, right?
Yeah, indeed. So his own diagnosis says, well, I'm going to get straight to treatment. Would you like grog or maybe a ham sandwich with some luscious white fat? And that's the kind of thing that you don't like when you see
right.
Stephen says, no, nothing like that. This is a serious matter calling for... and then he retches and says, oh, there it goes again. The Sophie, he says, had never behaved like this vile ship. And he says to Jack, could you turn down the lamp and go away? Surely, he says, this is a situation that requires all your vigilance. Surely this is no time to stand there idly smirking. How long can these tempests last? Oh, 3 or 4 days, no more, says Jack. Stephen thinks this is something that the human frame can perhaps only just about withstand for 3 or 4 days. And Jack sends Gilligan with a basin. I love it. This is often said about seasickness, Mike. There are 2 stages. In the first stage of seasickness, you're worried that you might die. And in the second stage, you're worried that you might not. And I think Stephen is on the cusp of the second stage there.
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, I think Jack was putting Stephen on a bit and having a great deal of fun at Stephen's expense, because at dawn, the sea is calm. It turns out they'd caught the very tail of the storm, and that Jack, now that the ships had been dispersed, he's now the senior captain, and he tells the Medusa to make more sail as they head for their next rendezvous off Cape Santa Maria, the landfall for Cadiz. So they're going to get pretty close here, but they only have 2 ships in the squadron at the moment. Well, at noon, Stephen comes on deck looking a little bit more human and humane.
Yeah.
It says he and Mr. Flores and Mr. Flores's assistants had spent the morning dosing one another. They had all suffered more or less from the onset of diseases, orchitis, scurvy, the fell Ludolphus palsy in Stephen's case. But in Matron's case, at least, the attack had been averted by a judicious mixture of Lacatellis's balsam and powder of Algaroth. And I'm thinking, you were seasick, fella. It's calm now. All that stuff wasn't necessary. But these guys are convinced. Yep, we've nipped it in the bud.
I had, I had weird bat fever, and I've taken unobtainium.
Right.
And as a result of that diagnosis and my superior clinical judgment, I'm now okay again.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's all fun. After dinner, then, there was enough calm in the weather to allow the lively crew members to exercise the great guns. And what with them being the livelies and what with there being a big swell, the rate of fire is pretty slow. 3 minutes and 10 seconds between broadsides. Very slow by Jack Aubrey standards, but more accurate by far despite the roll and pitch. So they're slow, but they're getting more accurate, which is going to be good news, I think.
Nice.
Meanwhile, the Medusa also puts in an hour's practice, and her crew are not only practicing at the guns, they're picking out the best, the truest, the roundest shot and chipping away flakes of rust. But it says most of her time was spent trying to overhaul the Lively before the Lively should shake out the last reef of most of her topsails. Now, it's become a little bit of a competition between the ships in the squadron here. The Medusa packed on sails, lost 2 booms, and still couldn't gain the half a mile that she was behind the Lively. And the guys aboard the Lively watched this in great pleasure, but with a bit of anxiety in their hearts. Are they going to be in time now, even with this favourable storm, even with their the great pace of their sailing, to cut off the Spanish squadron before it gets to Cadiz? Are they going to be able to rendezvous with the other ships who have been separated in a storm before the clash comes with the treasure fleet? If not, the odds aren't good. They are a 40-gun frigate and 3 34s, that's the Spanish side, against a 38 and a 32 on the British side. And the biggest of them in the squadron is the Indefatigable. She's 40 guns and she's way behind at this point. Jack had explained these tactical odds based on his sealed orders only once he was sure there was no danger that there'd be communication with the shore and that their operational security might be put at risk.
Yeah.
So we're starting to hear what's at stake here, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not only, Jack and the officers talking about this with this, new update and verification. The crew members are all buzzing about it, and they're very onto it because almost all of them know what comes from the River Plate. And for those who don't, they're quickly told it's gold and silver in leather bags and chests. And then, knowing this, despite everybody's urgency, it's not just Jack, kind of whistling and scratching on stays and holding his stomach clenched. Everybody is, like, whatever we can do to make the wind pick up. The wind declines during the day, and their 12 to 13 knots becomes 2 and a fathom barely.
Yeah.
And finally, on Thursday, October 2nd, their prayers are answered by a fair breeze. Well, as they pass St. Vincent, the Lively is exercising the guns, and the boatswain comes aft and kind of speaks with First Lieutenant Simmons. Simmons, listens to it, looks doubtful, hesitates, and steps across to the captain. And he tells Jack that the boatswain reports that the men, with the utmost respect, wish the captain to consider whether it would be advisable not to fire the bow guns. And Jack cries, do they also think it would be advisable to double the ration of grog? Oh no, sir, says a sweating crew with the gun nearest at hand. And Simmons orders silence. You're not supposed to address the captain here. And Simmons tries to explain that there's this general belief that firing the bow guns might check their way and time is short. And so Jack says, oh, okay. He reconsiders. He says there might be something in what they say, even though the philosophers don't believe it. Let's not run the risk. The bow guns will be run in and out and fired in dumb show. And as soon as he says this, there's this pleased smile that spreads all across the deck. And with this wish granted, the men start stripping down and, really preparing to run these iron monsters in and out, targeting less than 2.5 minutes of broadside. They're really stepping up now.
It's really funny. This situation has brought out the pirate in the crew of the Lively,
That's
right? And Jack is having to be the token Whig, the token science guy, saying, "Well, rationality says that this is nonsense, but never mind. I'm with you. Let's go with superstition."
Right.
Oh, it's great. There are a couple of broadsides fired, and there's some independent firing, and the tension is really strongly present on the ship because everybody knows that these orders have been confirmed, this tension rises to its highest pitch when the Medusa signals sail 1 point on the larboard quarter. And it's the Amphion with a jury fore topmast.
Ooh.
And Mike, if you're remembering the Magnificent Seven, this is the moment where Yul Brynner holds up 3 fingers, right? Because now we've got 3 of the 4. These 3 ships arrive at their rendezvous point, which is Cape Santa Maria off the coast of Portugal. And they're there the next morning with Sutton, the captain of the Medusa, taking the status of senior captain. They stand off and on all day, sweeping the Western Sea with their telescopes. And in the evening, Yul Brynner gets to hold up his 4th finger as the Indefatigable joins. The frigates are now spread out as far as they can, north and south, either side of the approach into Cadiz, staying in signal distance with each other, beating up and down, waiting to see if they can spot this treasure convoy as the men aboard the ships sharpen their cutlasses and pikes and carry on with chipping away and scaling the cannon shot.
Oh, nice. Well, they go back and forth across the oceans, watching for signals from the other squadron members and looking for the Spanish ships. And Jack remarks to Stephen that Anson did this for weeks and weeks, wondering how his people stood it. And he asks Stephen if he ever read Anson's book. And Stephen says, Anson wasted his opportunities.
Huh.
And Jack kind of looks a little puzzled. He said, well, Anson worried the Spaniards out of their wits and took the Manila galleon. You know, what more, Stephen, could you ask of Anson?
Yeah.
Stephen says, well, he could have paid a lot more attention to the natural world and taken a naturalist aboard with him. You know, he's upset that this guy went around the world and didn't record all this nature that was around him. You know, he could have done the world a great service. And Jack says, well, if Anson had taken you with him, he would have been godfather to half a dozen birds, saying Stephen would have discovered all these unknown species, probably named them after Anson. He said, however, Stephen, you would now be 96. So, you know, be careful what you wish for. Ian, Anson's got, you know, we hear about Anson a couple times in the canon, but he's got a big tie to real history and a big tie to Patrick O'Brien.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's one of those exploring admirals. It definitely belongs to the 18th century version of the Navy. He's definitely a Jack Aubrey adjacent sort of a sailor. Now, it's also the case that O'Brien used the voyages of Anson to inform 2 books that he wrote quite a long time before he started the Aubrey Maturin books. He wrote The Golden Ocean in 1956 about Anson's voyage around the world, and he wrote The Unknown Shore in 1959 about the voyage of the Wager, which was one of the ships in Anson's squadron. And if you recognize the name of the Wager, that's because it's the subject of this really excellent book by David Gran called The Wager. That's been very, I think most of you will have seen about it or read it. It's almost as though with those earlier books, O'Brien was, you could see those as being a bit of a warm-up for the Aubrey Maturin tales, you know, and you can almost imagine that he might have been consciously leaving the famous tales of the Nelson era and the Napoleonic era for his later efforts. I don't think so. I think he must have gone into the Anson stories on their own merits.
Right.
In 1959, C.S. Forester was still alive. O'Brien had no prospect of being asked by anybody to write about the Napoleonic era. But you can see in both books that O'Brien was sharpening his skills at writing and researching, you know, about the tones and the people and the events of the era. And he created characters in those books that look very much like prototypes for Stephen and Jack. And since later in our lives as podcasters, we might, maybe not many weeks from now, get to talk about the 2 books. I'm not going to go any further, except I think it's fair to say you've got prototypes for Stephen and Jack in those 2 books. The David Gran book is excellent. Mike, I've read it and you've audio read it, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's pretty grim reading.
Yeah, it is.
It highlights this really, really appalling story, the suffering and the circumstances that these people managed to survive. And this is perhaps as a sadness if you're one of the people waiting for the next movie treatment of a Patrick O'Brien book. The David Gran book is ahead of us in the queue. It seems to be quite a long way down the pathway towards being produced as a movie. I saw a thing in the paper this morning, Mike, claiming that Wager, if that's what its title turns out to be, is expected to be the final film in the career of none other than director Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, with Leonardo DiCaprio allegedly signed on. Now, there's an intriguing thought. What would a Tarantino treatment of a Patrick O'Brien story have been like?
oh boy, you blow my mind here now. Oh gosh. So Stephen now asked Jack, hey, what do you think to a little bit of music after tea? Oh. He says he's written a piece that he'd like Jack to hear, a lament for Tir Nan Og. And he calls this the only bearable part of my country. It vanished long ago. You've got to come back because you really opened my eyes on that one. But Jack says, got a lot to do right now, but once darkness falls, I'm your man and will lament to your heart's content. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, Tir Nan Og and the only bearable part of my country, Ireland, and it's gone. And I'm like, what's Stephen talking about?
Well, it's funny. Tir Nan Og, by the way, gets mentioned in the context of the Irish migrant characters in the James Cameron movie Titanic.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's another world. It's a heaven. It's a paradise in pre-Christian Irish mythology, a place of youth and beauty and health and abundance and joy. And if Stephen's lamenting its loss, it's a really touching moment. And if you think about it, maybe he's saying that beauty, in his case, in the form of Diana, is lost to him forever. If he can't any longer access or think of Tir Nan Og, it's to do with him not having the love of Diana. And maybe also, we know how attached he is to Ireland and the cause of its independence. He's reflecting that there's nothing beautiful left for him to celebrate about Ireland, not even the fantasy that it could be a kind of childishly heavenly place.
Wow.
So very, very touching moment here. Now, before dawn on the 5th, the lookout aboard the Lively hails that he can see a signal from the Medusa. And here's the plot moment. 4 large sail bearing west by south.
Ooh.
So the Indefatigable Squadron is now sitting squarely between these 4 ships and Cadiz, and the drumbeats of battle start to get a bit faster, I think. Stephen gets the chance to take a look for himself. He climbs into the main top and asks, is it the Spaniards? And Jack confirms that they are, just as there's a signal to wear and chase breaking out aboard the Indefatigable. Stephen knows that he's going to play a back office role, kind of coaching and directing this negotiator, Mr. Osborne, and he's preparing his lines in his mind. He knows that the negotiations with the Spaniards will be delicate because he knows something about the character of the kind of people that we're dealing with here. And during breakfast, the Commodore aboard the Indefatigable signals for Dr. Maturin. And therefore, Stephen, with a piece of bread and butter in his hand, steps into the cutter and is lowered away. He can see already now, close enough, that the Spaniards have formed their battle line, and they're so near that he can see wide open gun ports. Remember, at this point, Britain is still at peace with Spain. Intelligence says that Spain's about to enter the war on the side of France, but not officially yet. The Medusa then runs for the leading Spanish ship. 200 yards behind, the Indefatigable steers for the second. That's the Medea, with Admiral Bustamante's flag at the mizzen. The Amphion and the Lively, from their part, are close behind the Indefatigable. And once Stephen is lowered down, the Lively crosses the wake of the Amphion and heads for a particular one of the Spanish ships, the Clara. Mike, can I take a minute just to talk about the battle here?
I wish you would.
So there are some big commonalities and 1 or 2 interesting and funny differences between O'Brien's description here and the real-world action that this represents. It's known in the history books as the action of 5th of October 1804, known also as the Battle of Cape Santa Maria. And I don't know about every single detail, but in the broad strokes, it seems that O'Brien has described the lead-up to the action, that is to say, Spain being about to enter the war on France's side, about the intention that the Spaniards had to wait for the arrival of the treasure convoy before entering the war. All of that is pretty much as it happened. The names of the British and Spanish ships involved, the name and the character of Admiral Bustamante, the details of the 2 squadrons and how they initially came together in their peaceful status to pass messages and sort of parley with each other. All of that took place as it's described here. Some important differences. There was no intelligence briefing involving a shady figure aboard the Lively called Stephen Maturin. There was no negotiator named Osborne. And O'Brien, I think, put him here to be the sort of cover guy for the presence of a secret agent, a Spanish-speaking secret agent named Maturin, to allow him to be on the scene, kind of pulling the strings. There was somebody sent aboard Bustamante's flagship. That was a Lieutenant Ascot. But really, he wasn't there to negotiate. He was just there to send a message to say, Bustamante, your convoy is being detained. The answer that this guy brought back to the British squadron and its consequence, though, are the same as we're about to read about in this chapter. There is, of course, another difference. Although the names of the other British commanders, like Sutton of the Amphion, are taken straight from history, O'Brien has changed a couple of the names. Interestingly, he changed the name of the Commodore. In the historical action, his name was Graham Moore, and for some reason, O'Brien here uses Graham Moore's first name as a family name, so he names him as Captain or Commodore Graham. The other difference in personnel, of course, as we all know, is that in the real-world action, Captain Hammond of the Lively was there in person and wasn't being subbed by a jobbing captain called Aubrey. And an inconsequential difference that I think O'Brien must have invented to help the story, in the real-world action, Moore was acting under orders from Admiral Cornwallis, not under Admiralty orders, so the prize money calculation would have been different. It would still have been an enormous old chunk of prize money, but not quite as lucrative for the captains as we were led to believe for this one. Anyhow, that's enough about that. I'll just mention that in yet another fictional parallel universe, Captain Horatio Hornblower of C.S. Forrester fame was on the periphery of this battle too. So It was an exciting end of action to be used by two naval history authors.
Nice. Well, and we immediately get a little rationale, perhaps, why O'Brien chose to portray Graham Moore as Commodore Graham. It says, once aboard the flagship, the Commodore, a dark, red-faced, choleric man, very much on edge, pays little attention to Stephen's words as Stephen discusses the argument meant to persuade the Spanish admiral to yield. And this Commodore's really fidgeting, he's angry, he's excited, he's impatient. And Osborne instead is paying close attention to Stephen, the Commodore, not at all. And Stephen emphasizes that, for Osborne, you have to induce the admiral to come across so that the two of us, Osborne and Stephen, can jointly answer any unforeseen objections. So just, tell him what you need to tell him, get him over here, and let's come to a peaceful negotiation here. Well, the Commodore rushes them both up on deck, and he brings the Indefatigable 20 yards to windward of the Spaniard. And he orders the Spanish ships, the Spanish flagship, the one with the admiral, to shorten sail. But they don't. They just continue, flat out for Cadiz, which is only 2 hours away.
Yeah.
And finally, Graham, in this book, Graham, the Commodore, fires across their bows, and they clew up their topsails.
Wow. So, Osborne goes across on a boat, having been reminded by Stephen that he needs to bring Bustamante back aboard the Indefatigable if he ever possibly can. And above all, to remember this line that Stephen's prepared him with, that it's Godoy, the Spanish civil servant that we mentioned a couple of episodes back. Godoy has betrayed the kingdom to the French. The Commodore, meanwhile, says, tell the Spaniards they've got 5 minutes to make up their minds. Ooh. So, Mike, here we have, we've got the dove and the hawk. The hawk, the Commodore, is saying 5 minutes or they're toast. The dove, Stephen, with the help of Osborne, is hoping that we can have a peaceful negotiation and no bloodshed. Stephen goes below to wait for the outcome, hating the Commodore, hating what he thinks is about to happen, and like us, on tenterhooks to find out what happens next. Mike, this might be a good moment for a little mid-episode break. Shall we do that?
I think it's a grand idea.
If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Lover's Hole.
Welcome back. Hope you've got a little refreshment. Perhaps your popcorn is in hand. You're sitting back in your theater seats and waiting to see what's going to happen in this action. Well, O'Brien sets the scene for us. The Medusa now lays rocking gently beside the Fama. Yeah. The Amphion has slipped around under the Medea's lee, and she's now and back in the rear of this UK and Spanish line. The Lively is close to windward of the Clara. Yeah. Stephen sees that the Spaniards are in a remarkable state of readiness. Each gun is waiting with its crew, slow matches burning in a tub, alongside each of their long-range cannons. Graham is just there pacing up and down quickly, asking, is Osborne going to be there all night? And after a dozen turns, he's gone up and down a dozen times, he fires a gun across the Medea's bows. He's not waiting anymore on these negotiations.
Right. Now, I don't think we get to know for sure whether the gun precipitates things or whether the gun is merely punctuating what was already going to happen. But Osborne comes back across the water. You can see in his boat, he's shaking his head. He delivers compliments from Admiral Bustamante to the Commodore, and he delivers a message that says Bustamante cannot consent to being detained. Quietly, he tells Stephen that Bustamante had almost yielded when Osborne spoke about Godoy. Stephen, one last gasp, asks for permission to go across to try. There's still time, he says. The Commodore says they've had enough time, orders to have his ship laid across the Spaniard's bows. That's the moment, that's the kind of the aggressive posture that is just too much for the Spaniards. The Mercedes fires a crashing broadside straight into the Amphion. The Commodore signals close engagement, and the battle begins. And interestingly, Mike, we don't get straight into the gun crews and the powder and the sweat and the damage and the action. We don't get Jack's point of view. We get Stephen's point of view, and I think he's despairing here. Stephen, standing near the mainmast, his hands are behind his back, and he's looking up and down the line, up and down this battle scene. He hears the cheering of the gun crews, but the cheering is cut off by a huge explosion. Here's how O'Brien describes this. The Mercedes blew up in a fountain of brilliant orange light that pierced the sky. Spars, great shapeless timbers rained down out of the pillar of smoke, a severed head. And now, through their fall, there was the roar of guns again. And, by the way, this is certainly not the last time we're going to have a big explosion happening in the famous naval action. But, fire, gunpowder, etc. It's clearly a risk here. But it changes the balance of forces in this action dramatically. The Amphion can move up now, and the Spanish ship, the Medea, is now caught between two fires. And seeing this changing of the odds, the Spanish admiral strikes his colours. But, Mike, the firing's not done yet.
No. Even though, a ship is blown up, the admiral struck his colours, the Lively continues hammering the Clara, there at the end of the line, while the Medusa sends a few shots after the distant Fama. The Fama, it turned out, had struck her colours, then changed her mind and fled away to windward. Jack brings the Lively up after he's finished dealing with his ship here, the Clara, gives the Commodore joy and asks if he can go in chase. He wants to go after that ship that's fled. The Commodore tells him to chase for all he's worth, that the Fama has the treasure aboard. Wow. And, the Commodore's ship, the flagship, is too chewed up to chase. Jack says, can I have Dr. Matron aboard? I sent the Lively surgeon aboard the prize that Jack has just taken. And the Commodore sends Stephen over with a final word of encouragement to Jack. He tells Stephen to tell Jack not to let the Spaniard get away.
Right.
Whoa.
And this is a slightly underhand move by the Fama. She's decided to just flee the field here. She's untouched in her mast and rigging, so she's got all the means that she might need to set a decent pace, and she's already 3 miles away. The wind could well carry her to the Canaries or allow her to double back by night. Jack hauls Stephen aboard, who's been sent in reply to his request, hopes that Stephen's well, suggests that he should go to the gun room to wash the black powder off his face and then take breakfast with Jack. And as they're sitting down to breakfast with all of the repairing going on around them, Jack comes into the cabin and he sees there the Spanish captain, the defeated captain of the prize that they've already taken, sitting staring in a single chair. And we get a big contrast between the disconsolate figure of the first Spanish captain here, contrasted with Jack, who Stephen sees as bolt upright, larger than life, almost glowing. And Jack and Stephen get to talk briefly about the action, raising an interesting concern here. Despite the fact that this is all now actually, I think, turned out as everybody expected it would, this isn't the ideal that Stephen had in his mind. And they get to debating whether opening fire or causing the Spaniards to open fire was indeed a necessary stroke. Jack is pretty sure that it was. He calls it damn necessary, but Stephen doubts it. And Jack, who I think might have engaged in the debate a little bit, backs down when he sees Stephen jutting out his lower lip. So, this is not a peaceful or a triumphant moment for Stephen by any means. Jack suggests that they sit down to breakfast right away because they won't be meeting up with the farmer much before noon. So, breakfast is the cure for most ills, Mike. Stephen's got a job to do though, right? He's got to go back to the cockpit and see what's happening with the wounded in the care of his colleagues there.
Yeah, and so we've got Stephen. He's down. He thinks all these ships blowing up, all this death, and all these men lost, unnecessary. And for the first time in his entire life at sea, he's walking down and hears folks laughing in the cockpit where all their dead are, or all the wounded being treated here. And as he comes in, Mr. Flores's two assistants, Flores, of course, is on the prize, try to hide their bottle and jump up telling Stephen that the entire butcher's bill amounts to just 3 patients.
Wow.
2 splinter wounds, superficial, 1 musket ball, and a patient with a broken femur. Now, and there were only 2 men killed. In contrast to the very wild firing from the Mercedes, a seaman is proud to point out that the Lively had fired 17 broadsides in 28 minutes by Mr. Dashwood's watch. So that's 1 broadside every minute and 9 seconds, if I'm doing my math right there.
Yeah.
That's an incredible rate of fire.
That's
Jack's got to be pretty proud of these folks here.
Yeah. So, despite the fact that we've seen death and destruction with the blowing up of the Mercedes, things have been quite light, you might say, on the Lively here. The knotting and splicing continues. The Lively's catching up. She fetches the farmer's wake, and this sets in train a really serious stern chase. We know O'Brien loves writing about stern chases. Stephen then finds the captain's cabin still cleared for action. The guns are still warm. There's still a smell of gunpowder. There's even an 18-pound Spanish cannonball rolling around under a gaping hole in the Lively's side. But there, sitting very glumly, is the Spanish captain, Don Ignacio. And he's really reluctant to accept an offer that Stephen makes for him to have some kind of refreshment, some kind of drink. Jack walks in and joins Stephen in the cabin. He's upset to realize, I think, that Jack, had forgotten to pay attention to the Spanish captain. But even after the formalities are taken over here and Don Ignacio is introduced to Captain Aubrey, the Spanish captain is still not interested in accepting the offer of a drink, of any kind of refreshment. And maybe this is taking a bit of a shine off Jack's bonhomie here that he's feeling in the wake of the victory and the hoped-for chase that's coming here.
Yeah. Well, Jack is really feeling for the Spanish captain.
Yeah.
He's telling Stephen, he remembers what it was like to lose his ship. He remembers what it was like to be taken prisoner. And he tells Stephen that he had allowed Don Ignacio to keep his sword to take a little of the sting away. And he quizzes Killick about their supplies, and he says, Killick, how are we fixed for mutton? And Killick says, oh, not to worry, we've got plenty, at least for 3, enough for 3. And Jack says, well, Killick, I want you to set the table for 4, and I want you to use my new silver plates.
Are these the ones with the Horselade?
Right, the big...
which were not fit to be used.
Yeah, your bread of...
The bread of afflictions are going to be eaten off the Horselade plates.
Tears of misery.
Well, Stephen gets to congratulate Jack on his victory, but he comes back to his own kind of downbeat assessment of the situation. He hopes, he says, that Jack may not have bought it too high. And Mike, that's a curious thing for him to say, since he's just been in a sick bay where there was, two broken legs and a sprained ankle or whatever it was. And clearly, I think he's not thinking about the Lively. He's certainly thinking about the casualty aboard the Mercedes that had blown up. Maybe when he says, hope you haven't bought it too high, he means there could be unintended consequences for the fleet, for the whole of Britain, for all of the Allies, in triggering war against Spain in this particular way. And maybe also, when he says, I hope you haven't paid too much for this victory, he might be thinking a bit selfishly, going back to his lament for Tir na Nog. However good things look now, he maybe is saying to Jack, however good things look now, you'd be amazed at what kind of disappointment might come back to confound you. So he's sowing a tiny seed of doubt in Jack's mind and in our minds that this apparent glorious turnaround in all their fortunes might not be all that it seems.
Ooh. Well, the Lively is sailing for all she's worth. The squadron and the prizes are far astern. The Medusa has been detached from the squadron to join the chase for the Fama, but she is hauled down a great way off. Yeah, she's coming, but she's a long, long way out. The Fama appears to be about the same distance ahead, or maybe a little bit more, when the Livelies look to see her. But they're pretty much unconcerned. They're replacing cordage and blocks, and occasionally you're kind of casting a casual eye back at the chase. These are not the guys, absolutely standing there looking at nothing else. The men in the top are talking casually. They're laughing. A carpenter's mate walks by Jack unbidden. He says, "Won't be long now, sir." And Jack says, well, the Lively stancel booms had been smashed and the Famas were untouched. Jack says, just wait until we rig ours out. Stephen says that the Fama appears to be running extremely fast. And Jack says, yep, she's a flyer with some of the sweetest lines. Supposedly, she just had her bottom cleaned. And Jack points out that, look, Stephen, she's throwing her guns overboard. I'll bet she'll start her water over the side soon. He says, Stephen, don't you remember? You remember we were doing that when we were being chased? You were sweeping like a hero, as, we pumped our water over the side. You were sweeping in the Sophie, but the Fama doesn't have any sweeps. And as the last of the guns from the Fama go into the ocean, Jack notes how the Fama, one of the fastest sailors the Spanish have, is pulling away. And Stephen says, well, you mean to catch her? Right. You're so excited about how fast she's leaving us. And then Stephen also looks back and says, and the Medusa is falling farther behind. So, the Fama's leaving us. The Medusa's not helping. What's going on?
Right. And all the way through this latter half of the chapter here, Stephen is Debbie Downer. Right. And Jack is Captain Irrepressible.
Right.
Here he goes. He says, I do not like to show away, Stephen, but I will bet you a dozen of any claret you choose to name against a can of ale that we lay her aboard before dinner.
Wow.
You may not think it, but her only chance of escape is a ship of the line heaving up ahead, or our carrying a mast away. Though she may wing us, too, if she keeps her chases. Will you not touch on wood when you say that? I take your wager, mind, says Stephen. Jack looks secretly at him. The dear creature's spirits were recovering a little. He must have been sadly shocked by that explosion. So, a little bit of empathy there, inwards from Jack, but outwardly he carries on the conversation. No, this time I shall defy fate. I did so in any case when I desired Killick to lay 4 places. The 4th is for the captain of the Fama. I shall invite him. I shall not give him back his sword, however. It was a shabby thing to do, to strike and then run. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Jack's pretty sure of himself. He's in high status mode here. So let's see what's going to happen with this chase, Mike.
Well, Dashwood, the lieutenant, comes by, reports that all is ready. And Jack says, that was capital work. Mr. Dashwood, rig him out, if you please. And the Lively shows this great spread of canvas with perfect efficiency and speed. And O'Brien tells us the farmers' hearts sink and die. Yeah. And their water now is all of it's going over the side, and Jack orders more sails to be set. The Lively leans forward and really starts to show her paces, eating the wind out of the Fama as the distance narrows.
Right. So the farmer has everything out. Despite that, the Lively's catching up. When the farmer tries to set more, Jack and the officers on the quarterdeck shake their heads. It will never answer, not with the wind so far aft. The farmer is clearly trying her last few desperate gasps of manoeuvres. She steers wild and loses 200 yards in the process. Jack has Dashwood send a message to the master to say, try the bow guns. I should like to win my bet. And he notices here that it's 12:45, very close to the hour of dinner. After 2 carefully placed shots, the farmer strikes before a third can be fired. Jack has Dashwood take possession of her and tells him, send the captain back for dinner.
When the captain comes over and presents his sword with a bow, Jack passes the sword to Bondon. Yeah. You don't get to keep that one. Learning that the officer speaks a little English, Jack tells him dinner is waiting in the cabin. I was expecting you, basically. Well, they eat at an elegant table in the transformed cabin. It had been all stripped down. It's all put back now. And the Spaniards behave extremely well, especially since they'd been down to biscuit and chickpeas for the last 10 days.
Yeah.
And after several courses of food, a number of wine bottles, the tension wears away, and the talk flows freely in Spanish, English, and a sort of French.
There was even laughter and interruption. And when at last the noble pudding gave way to comfits, nuts, and port, Jack sent the decanter round, desiring them to fill up to the brim. And raising his glass, he said, Gentlemen, I give you a toast. I beg you will drink Sophia. Sophia, cried the Spanish captains, holding up their glasses. Sophie, said Stephen. God bless her. End of Post Captain.
Wow.
Oh,
man.
Wow. Great book.
Oh, really great book.
There's some things that we should talk about. I'll mention, I know we talked about the historical context for the action. Jack has stolen the thunder here of a very respectable naval officer, this guy, Captain Hammond of the Lively. If you're interested in the real Captain Hammond, there's a great piece on the More Than Nelson website. We'll post a link to that. There's all kinds of exciting things to read about in terms of Captain Hammond's career. But meanwhile, Mike, let's go back to the closing of this book and where we've got to. Let's talk about that final toast there. Sophie, or should I say Sophia?
Yeah. I'm just so delighted that Jack has finally owned up to his feelings for Sophie.
Yeah.
And all appears to be going not just well, but extremely well. Jack and Sophie are back together. Jack's had a huge victory now under his belt. And hopefully if Melville is still First Lord, he might still be in time to reward Jack with a ship before leaving office. And in any event, the size of this prize under Admiralty orders, no other admiral to share in the prize, sounds like Jack could easily pay off his debt given that amount of money. And so, ship or no, he's all set there. And Stephen had originally Stephen said $1 million, but I remember when he's talking to Sir Joseph Belaying, talking about what the reported amount of gold on this thing was. It's huge. But even in Stephen's lower example, this prize could bring both of them 75,000 pounds, Wow. Not kind of the way the book started out.
75,000 here, 75,000 there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money.
Right.
And Mike, I love the contrast, the turnaround from the way the book started. In the beginning of the book, Stephen was in command. He took control of the situation. He was the one who rescued Jack from debtors and saved Jack by smuggling him in the bear suit across the border. Stephen is still doing relatively well in his life. His intelligence has enabled this victory, even though he's not happy about the way it came about.
Right.
The Admiralty loves him. He got his friend Jack in good order into the battle and back with Sophie and back in funds. Stephen, gets a captain's share of the prize money. And taking the Spanish treasure ship also has a big step forward for Catalan independence, which was one of Stephen's big dreams. And he and Jack between them had got through their falling out over Diana. So if you're Team Stephen, all the things in the positive column of the scorecard are pretty great. But I think trumping all of that, there's the loss of Diana, or rather the loss of the love connection between him and Diana that is causing him immense personal pain, adding in as well personal pain from what he sees as the unnecessary battle and the unnecessary loss of life. It seems that whatever is in the positive column of the Team Stephen score sheet, he would probably rather have Diana than any number of the other kind of gains here. And seeing that at the end of this chapter here, Jack was reading his reaction, reading his friend's condition, noticing how frail he is, judging how much pressure and banter he can take rather than the other way around. It's a really telling moment to just how low Stephen is.
Yeah.
And a great bit of kindness and maturity as well from Jack to turn the conversation a little bit away from just exulting in the condition of the battle here.
Right. It seems a long time, and it is a long time. It's a big book, a long time since chapter 1. But look at how many of the twists and turns of the early chapters have now been paid off. You know, Steve Morse, a lot of questions. Hopefully we've got a lot of answers, and we've stolen your, the payoffs here phrase that we, love on the Cinephiles. Well, Jack's fortunes are restored, enabling him to treat the Spanish captains to the same genteel hospitality that he and Stephen received from Christy Pallier back when they were captured, back at the beginning of this book. Music was a touch point for the beginning of our two great love affairs, both women playing Hummel on the out-of-tune piano at Mapes. And, it was likewise the touch point for the apparent end of Stephen and Diana's love in the scene we witnessed at the opera.
Right.
And boy, you're always our man on music here, and O'Brien just using it so beautifully here.
Yeah. And think about where we were at the beginning. We didn't have Melville in as First Lord. We had Lord St. Vincent. It could well be that here at the end of the book again, Melville's gone. And if so, in that extra bit of symmetry with the earlier chapters, it could be bringing a big change for the fortunes of Jack and Stephen. How big a change? I guess we'll just have to see.
Overall, what do you think? What's your assessment here?
Well, I mean, I always kind of smile when somebody asks me what's my favorite Patrick O'Brien book, and I say whichever one I'm reading.
Right.
So I'll allow myself that latitude. It's a really, really great book. Right up there for my list of favorites. Made even more so, I think, by the extra juice that we've got out of it from reading it more slowly this time. I've really, really enjoyed digging into all of the little layers and allusions and the depth of the character and the dark of the darkness and the light of the lightness has been really, really fantastic.
Yeah, I love watching O'Brien make this series truly his, and maybe his and Jane Austen's in this case here. What a great balance of O'Brien and Jane Austen and Charles Dickens with some of our secondary characters coming up here. Yeah. We've got land and sea, men and women, in a very different way than Master and Commander. And that big change in the women characters, the big difference between them in Master and Commander and Post Captain. I love that. Yeah. Ian, I think, and you've talked about this so many times, by the standards of a lesser author, there would be enough material in Post Captain for at least 2 books. Yeah. And by O'Brien's own high standard, there's been enough here for 1.5 books. Right. Which perhaps goes some way to explain why this book can sometimes be a hard one to fall in love with the first time you read it. Yeah. Almost everything in canon is about 10 chapters long. This one's 14 chapters. It takes us much deeper, much darker, much more complex human territory than Master and Commander. And certainly, we weren't going shallow with Dylan. No. But even more so here, I think it makes it a book that on reflection and repeated reading, has to qualify as one of the real high points in the canon. You and I have talked about that. I absolutely agree with you on that point. Yes, there's a bear suit. Yes, there's. But let me tell you, let's not be distracted here. And I actually enjoyed some of that, but fabulous here.
Yeah, and as we talked about, he's laid the foundation for the friendship, for the joys and the flaws of the friendship between Jack and Stephen, and the joys and the flaws as well of the Jack and Sophie and Stephen and Diana relationships, which, without too many spoilers, are going to be the raw material for this fantastic arc that's got another 19 books to go. We don't need to go through every thought that we've had about every chapter here, but I think it's really great. As you say, O'Brien making the series and making the era and making the genre really his own. And that's the testament to that is that everybody's still here. You and I are still reading this over and over and again and delighting in it. And everybody who's listening and talking online about the books is relishing it. It's a really, really high standard. If you think about the way he's treated friendship and loyalty and duty and love and used them as the foundation for a novel about humanity, I think it's a really, really high bar to set. It's a really, really powerful arc to set in motion that he's done here.
Well, I for one, can't wait to see what happens the week after next in chapter 1 of HMS Surprise. I almost said next week, but it's not. We'll have our 200th celebration episode with the Q&A, your wonderful questions. But, chapter 1, I've got to say that I always have the same answer as you, Ian. What's my favorite book? The one I'm reading now. But if I had to say, okay, you got to press on. Yeah. I think for so many times it's been HMS Surprise. And I've told some folks that I thought would, have a tough time with all the nautical in Master and Commander, might not want to pick up the size of Post Captain and some of the things we've already talked about. You know what? Try HMS Surprise. And I love how, even though you've read it so many times, the questions remain. And I think sometimes I'm still here. And we had in our last long run up with the canon, a conversation, me and Rachel McMillan, and Rachel was telling me, telling us things that we all known and read before. I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that. Yeah. big plot points. But so even now, and I'm just feeling, because I think O'Brien writes this well, are the riches of this fabulous victory going to mean financial security for Jack Aubrey and Jack, almost fiancée Sophie Williams? Will life as an intelligent agent carry Stephen Maturin farther away of this wreckage of his love with Diana into a new chapter in his life? Yeah. Spain, now war with Britain, and Stephen exquisitely qualified to take full part in that. We know if he played a big role up until now with Spain back in the war, Stephen is, going to be completely up to his eyeballs in that, I would think. I would think so too. So we've got a lot ahead of us. As you say, Mike, immediately ahead of us next week, we've got a bicentenary celebration, which is listener Q&A. Thank you again to everyone who's chipped in some questions. We're looking forward to enjoying our discussion of all those questions with you. We hope that you're going to enjoy that as much as we've been enjoying putting it together. We hope you'll be listening in. That'll be a whole episode next time. The week after that, Mike, exactly as you say, we'll be pulling down HMS Surprise, Chapter 1. What do you say then, the week after next, Mike, to just a little bit more of this great Patrick O'Brien? With all my heart. Welcome to the Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. I'm sitting here with Ian. Ian, who are you sitting next to? Sorry, I had a complete blank there. There's an even better one. So they're going to just keep getting better here. But we've been working like all week, up all night. Yeah, here we go. Ian's on a different time zone. Let's do it again. All right. 2 take Bradley. That's what they call me.